Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Film Kid Asks, the podcast where I ask questions to working professionals in the film industry from the perspective of someone just getting started. Today, I'm joined by award-winning Canadian cinematographer behind projects like In the Tall Grass, Fargo Seasons 2 and 3, and Tales from the Loop, Craig Wrobleski. You can see his new work on the second season of The Umbrella Academy, airing on July 31st on Netflix. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, you studied broadcasting and started your career as a studio cameraman and then shifted to independent work and documentaries. In the early stages of your career, what were some of the biggest learning experiences that you had, and what did you find most valuable to your development?
That's a good question. I guess the biggest thing was kind of figuring out what I wanted to do, because I actually I had a kind of a long road to this, but it was, I originally wanted to do radio. And then I went to school for radio, and then I realized I didn't like radio. And then I switched to television because that's how the course worked. And I became obsessed with the camera. And I originally went to be a news cameraman. That was because I thought that's what you did with the cameras. You shot news. It didn't occur to me that people shot movies, they shot commercials, they shot all sorts of things. For some reason, I thought I was just so linear. I just thought news. Partially because that's what the course offered, was news. That was kind of their focus. So I graduated and I did a practicum in the news department, and I realized I didn't actually want to be a news cameraman because it's kind of soul crushing to go out every day and just like capture car accidents and all this terrible stuff. And I just didn't think that was for me. I ended up getting a job in the studio, and it was in the studio that I discovered American Cinematographer magazine, and that kind of opened the world up to me realizing that, you could actually use a camera to do all sorts of other things. It sounds so stupid to talk about it because, of course, you use a camera to shoot movies, but for some reason, I never connected those things together. And I was reading American Cinematographer and thinking, this is incredible. Look what these people are doing. And I just, everybody else that worked at the studio had kind of been there for a long time and kind of wasn't interested in the camera anymore as a storytelling tool. They were just kind of used it to shoot the news. And I just found every copy of American Cinematographer they had, which was like all dusty piles of them everywhere. And I just started reading them and taking them home. And I just kind of became obsessed with it. So I quit the studio after a year and basically freelanced, and I've been freelanced ever since. But where the story's taken me is, the thing you learn is that you realize what you want to do. That's the most important thing, because you have to have a personal attachment to this work, because otherwise it's just a lot of work. I mean, it is a lot of work to do what we do. And if you're attached to it personally and you feel a real passion and a connection to it, it's not work anymore. Then it's an actual quest and an actual growth experience where, you become a better human being by virtue of what you're doing, because it nurtures you, and it also helps you to find your way through the world. I mean, that's what I realized only fairly recently, was the cameras actually is kind of my tour guide to the world, because left to my own devices, the world confuses me, to be honest.
So, how did you find that shift from something more technical, like working in, studio broadcasting, to then trying to tell stories visually and artistically? What was kind of your process from shifting from that technical side, and how did that serve you?
Well, it was sort of, for lack of a better word, an organic process. It wasn't really like a flipping a switch. It was this sort of process of kind of finding my way through it, because after I quit my job at the studio, I kind of just did whatever I could do on a set. I drove motorhomes, I got coffee, I did whatever. I mean, I literally have done every job on set at one point or another. Not many of them very well, but I've done them all at one point or another. All with the sort of goal of ultimately getting to shoot and be a cameraman. So it was a long road, and it was a road that was extremely valuable, because it's important to know what everybody does on set, because that's, ultimately you all have to work together. So the more you know what other people do, the better you can do what you do to make it work within the greater good. So it was a real natural process, and it took a long time. I mean, I shot for, I think, about 16 or 17 years before I even started doing drama, just doing documentaries, music videos, commercials, corporate videos, you name it. Like, shot everything there is to shoot at one point or another.
So, kind of speaking of that, working in Canada, I feel like a lot of creatives have to really diversify, and I think that's obviously true for you as well. So, as far as like film, TV, commercials, documentaries, etc., what do you think has taught you the most about your craft?
They've all certainly taught me something. I mean, I constantly marvel at how every day on set I find myself drawing on some random experience I had that I never thought I would use again. But you find like, oh, I remember I did this thing way back when, and it was in a similar room, and I did this, you know. So you start to sort of collect a kind of muscle memory of everything you've ever done. But I'd say the biggest thing, the biggest teaching tool I had was shooting documentaries. That was invaluable. Just not only because it really helps you grow as a person because you learn a lot about the world, but also shooting documentaries makes you really quick on your feet. It really hones your instincts about storytelling because you basically have things happening in front of you in real time. And you have to tell the story to the audience and capture the essence of that moment and the essence of what's happening in real time and convey that to the audience. So you really have to understand editing. You have to understand shooting. You have to be able to walk into a room and assess the lighting really quickly and figure out what you need to do to make it, you know, look the best it can but still be real. And, you know, so there's all sorts of tools because essentially with a documentary, you're trying to capture reality. And in a lot of dramatic storytelling, you're essentially doing the same thing. You're trying to create reality and create a reality to the audience. So ultimately, you're using the camera as a storytelling tool in both genres, documentary and drama, but you're doing it in very different ways. But the documentary training, pardon me, and documentary experience was invaluable to telling dramatic stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely see a lot of those different influences in your body of work. Do you think that having a very diverse background has helped you in your career versus someone who may have found a genre or niche earlier on? And has that helped you grow as an artist?
Well, I think obviously, you know, having a wide scope of experience is really valuable as a creative person. You know, drawing on a wide range of influences. I mean, the risk is always that you become kind of a victim of your own obsessions. You can become so interested in one thing that you don't realize there's a whole wide scope of other things out there. You know, so like I draw a lot of inspiration from painting and photography, arguably more than I do from movies and television, because I like to try and find a way in to a project that isn't necessarily kind of through the front door. I mean, sometimes you find a way into the side door, you come in through the back door, you knock a hole in the roof, whatever, but you find a way into it that isn't necessarily the sort of most direct way. And I think having a diverse range of influences is really helpful because you can then also speak to your other creative collaborators about a wide variety of things where you can say, you know, I really feel like the color palette in here should feel like, you know, a Caravaggio painting, and this, you know, the lighting should have sort of a, you know, Todd Hito vibe or whatever. Like you can sort of mash all these things together, and ultimately I think that helps you create work that's more unique, as opposed to saying, I really want this to look like Seven, you know, and that's like sort of that's the end of the conversation. It's like, well, I know what Seven is, let's do that. Sometimes in a meeting, you know, you get these weird looks because you'll throw out some random influence where it's like, you remember that thing? And people are like, what are you talking about? But then you kind of talk about it a little more and you realize there's something there. And then you find your way to fit that in. So I think ultimately you know, the diversity of what I've done with commercials, music videos, all that has been nothing but helpful because I find myself drawing on those skills all the time, especially on a show like Umbrella Academy where, you know, you'll have a very intimate personal moment and then you'll have something completely insane happening in the next scene, and you have to be able to use all those tools in the toolkit to tell those stories. And I find myself drawing on that all the time.
So, looking at your career, you didn't really necessarily work your way up through the camera truck so much as worked on smaller projects that then became bigger and bigger as your career progressed. So, what do you think the benefits were to that approach?
Right. Well, I mean, it's to each their own. Ultimately, I mean, different people will find their way through it in a different way. I mean, I remember the moment I was actually in the camera trainee program for a week with IATSE, and I remember just going. I remember actually doing the math in my head, going, okay, like if I take the union approach, I'll be a trainee. I'd be a second assistant. I'd be a first assistant. I'd be a camera operator, and then I'd be a DP. And I kind of did the math and said, okay, let's say I spend 2 or 3 years in each of those roles to kind of work my way up. That's, you know, 12 years, 14 years. And I remember telling myself, if I'm not a DP in 14 years and I'm not shooting stuff in 14 years, then I don't know if I was meant to be a DP. So I kind of made a deal with myself and said, okay, I'm going to go on my own way and try this out and see if it works and see if I can find my way. And if I just find that I'm lost, or I just, there's no road for me, then I could, go back and try the union approach again. Um, and I'm glad I took the road I did, because I think it was the best thing for me. And I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. I mean, I arguably don't have the knowledge base that I would have had if I'd stayed in the union, in the sense of gathering information of how different people work, how large sets work, how small sets work, and some of the protocols and, the kind of nuances of things of union projects. Arguably I had to learn kind of trial by fire by, entering the union as a DP. But I wouldn't trade my experience for anything, because what it did was it gave me a voice of my own. I didn't learn necessarily in a choir, so to speak. I kind of learned singing on my own and kind of found my voice that way. And I mean, I sang with a lot of other people, to continue the analogy, but I didn't sort of learn in a formal setting. I kind of learned as I went.
So now you're obviously working with bigger crews. And so, as someone who may want to go into the camera department, what makes a person stand out when they're working, and what skills should a person have to do well?
Well, there's a lot of skills. The camera department is the one department that works with every other department on set. You're always busy. There's never a dull moment in the camera department. You're never really off. You don't really have downtime. You're just flat out all day. So being a collaborator is a really important skill, and working well with other people is really important. And then there's just that sort of intangible quality of, do you get it or not? Because there's people who come to set and you can tell they get it. They understand the environment. They understand how it works. They understand the collaboration and respecting other people's jobs, and, how that affects how the day goes. Because the camera department, is, because we deal with everybody, it's super important that we all kind of set a standard for behavior in terms of interaction and collaboration. It's easy for the camera department to become kind of the most hated department on set if people don't treat each other with respect. If the camera department feels like the camera department is above all the other departments, it doesn't work. We have to all be in this together, and we have to all be coming at it from the same direction and with the same approach to make it work. And that involves collaboration and communication. So those skills are really important. And also, when you come on set, certainly if you were to join the camera department in a union project, you'd be a trainee, which, is not a glamorous position. You're not yelling action. You're not setting exposures. You barely get to touch the camera, but it's a valuable learning experience to be on set. And the smart ones, and the ones who get it, come in understanding that this is a massive opportunity to learn and absorb information. And I've had a lot of trainees that come on, and, you keep bringing them back. And over the years, then they become your second, and then they become a focus puller. And, you find these people who, rise quickly through the ranks because they kind of play well with others and they understand how the process works.
So, kind of going off of that, you've obviously worked with a number of different crews, directors, producers. What makes for an overall great set environment?
Respect is a huge part of what makes a good set work. I mean, every job on film set is important. I mean, I've always said that, if the camera operator flubs a shot, it's no different than if the PA that, blows a lockup and one extra, or a person walks through the background of the shot because the PA didn't stop them. That's the same. We still have to go again. It's the same kind of thing. It doesn't mean that the PA's job is less important than the operator's, because when either job doesn't work, that means we have to go again and there's a problem. So every job is really important. And I think it's critical that everyone on set respects each other, respects what everybody has to do, because everybody's job is important to them, which is also how a good set works. When everyone is super passionate about their job and really cares about what they're doing, that's when it works the best. So with that can come friction, where, you're saying, well, I think it should be this way, and they say, I think it should be that way. But ultimately, it's about collaboration and respect, and valuing other people's opinions and valuing their input. That's when the set works the best. I mean, when it becomes, ego battles, or, the sort of the race to be right about everything. That doesn't work.
So, getting even more specific, what makes a great creative partnership and collaboration with a director?
Well, the key to a great working relationship with a director is when you're on the same page. I mean, I think the whole industry generally works best with when you have kindred spirits and like minds working together. That's when the whole business really, really cooks and really clicks along, and you can have a really productive day. And it's no different with a director. Ultimately, you're making their movie. As a DP, you're in support of their vision. That doesn't mean that you're a servant to them. It just means that, ultimately you have to be on the same page as them. And, part of the process of prep is getting on that page and understanding where they're coming from and understanding how that vision can be visualized and made practical and made real. So it's all about getting on the same page. And, when you have that relationship, it's just, there's this beautiful sort of unspoken language that you have with the director where you just kind of just look at each other and go, yeah, okay. And you go do it. You don't really have to talk about every nuance. You don't have to, the film set's the most productive environment when sort of 80% of the conversations don't even have to happen. And you can just talk about the 20% of the conversations that make it the best thing it can be. You don't have to talk about the mechanics to get it there. You can just talk about how to make it amazing.
So it sounds like a lot of it has to do with trust and respect, kind of going back to what you had originally said. And I think that is important at every level of filmmaking. So
And in life.
And in life. So obviously you have worked on some smaller projects, indie projects, but also on some really big budget projects. So what are kind of the best and worst parts of working on a big budget production versus a small budget production?
It's a tough question. I mean, I guess the worst part is when the pressure of a big budget production overtakes the process of creating it. You can sort of say that the project can collapse under its own weight, where there's so much riding on everything because of the budget so high that it kind of chokes the process. And, it becomes a fear-based creative process, which is never, it's a contradiction in terms because there's no such thing as a fear-based creative process. You can't create out of fear. You have to create out of, fear in the sense of nervous energy is a good thing, but fear in the sense of like paralysis, where you can't make a decision because every decision is going to cost so much money. It's not a healthy way to work. So that's always the risk on a big budget production. The risk on a small budget production is the polar opposite of that, in that you don't have enough money to make the decisions and do the things you want to do. So, both of them have their downsides, but it ultimately, I think as long as it's proportionate, when there's enough money and enough time to do the story justice, then it's okay.
Yeah, so what should students be taking advantage of while filming micro budget and student films, and what should students be experimenting with and practicing while working on these small budget productions, do you think?
Well, I think that's when you're a student cinematographer, that's the time to take advantage of the freedom you have, where you have the freedom to find your voice and to find your way without the kind of scrutiny and downward pressure that you'll experience, once you're paid to do the job. Once you get hired, there's a certain level of scrutiny and there's a certain level of pressure from above that is inherent to the job, and that's part of it, and you have to accept it. But when you're a student, there's less of that. And I think that's a prime opportunity to, spread your wings and find your way without sounding cliche about it. Like there's a real opportunity to kind of stick your neck out and try things. And if it doesn't work, then that's your opportunity to learn something. If it does work, then you can put that tool in your toolkit and take it with you down the road. But that's the real value of it is, and that's why I've done a lot of projects with friends and collaborators where we just go out and just shoot stuff, which, sounds like a simplified version of it, but we go out with a very, an idea that we're intrigued by and something that we feel very passionate about. And we do it outside of the kind of pressure and scrutiny of a sort of quote unquote professional environment, which is a great way to, to test things and to try things and to do things you've always wanted to do, but maybe you've never had the opportunity to do, or there's never been the forum for it in a sort of professional environment.
So what to you is the most creative part of the process, and where along the line do you feel that you can author your voice the most?
Hmm. In terms of the authorship, I would hope that there isn't, and I think if the process is working well, there isn't one point when you kind of put your stamp on it. I think it's that sort of process of being a voice all through the process in the interest of going to a goal and leading to a goal that hopefully is in line with everything that you and the director talked about and that the script is asking for. There's a great saying that says, the stronger your work is, the fainter your signature becomes. And I think it's true. When you're starting out, sometimes there's a tendency to kind of put your stamp on and say, like, this is me and this is what I do. And that's valuable because it's important to find that voice. But ultimately, you sort of want to be more and more invisible as the process goes on. And you just want your work to blend into the story in a seamless and invisible way to the audience. So the photography is strictly supporting the story. And you don't really, you're not showing off and you're not drawing too much attention to yourself. You're just drawing attention to the story and the characters. I think the most purely creative process is on set. Prep is its own form of creativity in the sense that you're building something, you're constructing something, but it's a different kind of process. I mean, there's an immediacy to what you do on set and an instant gratification to what you do on set where, all that prep and all that process that got you there, and then you see whether it works or not. And when it works, it's the best feeling in the world because you're just like, there it is. That's what we talked about. We've been working towards this and all this energy of the whole crew, the whole production's been working towards this moment. And there it is. And now it's captured forever, and that's an incredible feeling. And that's, I think, the most creative part when you can get all of the elements to work together, all the people, all the equipment, all, the light, the timing, all of those elements that, is really complicated and hard to do on any size of production. It doesn't matter. There's a lot of moving parts on any project. And when you can get those moving parts to all mesh together and get that machine moving in one direction, and that one direction is amazing, it's a phenomenal experience.
So, as someone who didn't go to a traditional film school but did study broadcasting and kind of worked in broadcasting before you transitioned to film, what are your thoughts on film school? And is there anything regarding your schooling or education that you'd wish you'd done differently?
I mean, I'm really happy with where I'm at, so I wouldn't say that I would have done anything differently because it all worked out pretty well. But if I was to go back and do it again, arguably I would go to an art school more so than a technical school, because the one thing that they don't teach, at least at the technical school I went to, is they don't teach you the creative process. They don't teach you those intangible elements of collaborating with people and also just becoming a creative person and understanding, what that is and how it affects how you think, to think like a creative person. Because you can think like a technician, which is very, 1+1 = 2. But then as a creative person, you're thinking 1+1 could, maybe it means something else. You start going down these avenues and roads that a technical school wouldn't necessarily afford you. Be interested to go to an art school to kind of learn that process and learn about creativity kind of from the inside out and from the ground up. It just enable you to find yourself as a creative person, which I think is really valuable.
So, the last question I have for you before we kind of open it up to some of my friends is, what advice would you give to someone who is just starting their career now and aspiring to be in your position one day?
The one piece of advice I would give is to find your voice. I mean, it's hard to say that without sounding corny and cliche, but it's true. Like, in order to do this job in a way that's fulfilling as a person, you need to speak with your own voice. There's the risk of spending a whole career imitating people and, saying, oh, I just saw this movie and I'm going to make it look like that, which is, flattering. Imitation is a form of flattery, but in terms of the actual getting a lot out of it as a human being, I find that speaking with your own voice then enables you to really communicate with people in a really real way and really connect with the audience in a very personal and intimate way, which I think you have to. And I think that's when the stories really, really work. It's incredibly fulfilling. And I think it's the most important thing. And unfortunately, the B side of that answer is that you have to be patient because it takes a long time to find your voice. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. You might have revelations here and there, where you'll wake up one morning and go, I figured that part out. but it's one part of a huge equation. And finding your voice is actually a lifelong experience. I mean, I always say that this is a job that you never get good at, you just get better. And I think it's true. I mean, there isn't a day goes by that I don't learn something about my job. I don't learn something about myself, and I don't learn something about the people around me. And that's all part of the process of finding that voice. And I think that's the best way to go. I mean, ultimately, you'll be hired for who you are and for how you see the world. That's what your own voice is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's incredibly important. So now we're going to open this up to a few of my fellow film students and friends, and they're going to ask some questions to you.
You said that you had a lot of experience and you built yourself up through like music videos. You started in the news, you did commercials, you went across like as an independent. And I just wanted to know, like, how did you start to put yourself out there? Like from the very, very, very beginning, like after you finished your technical schooling, what kind of were your steps towards like making, before your name was made, like through everything that you did? How did you kind of approach that?
It's really about relationships. I mean, everything I say sounds corny to me, but I don't know. It's not corny. It's the truth. It's a relationship industry, and I think it came from just when I quit my job at the studio, and I went out. I went out and just was so interested and curious about the business, and really wanted to learn about how it all worked. And I think that resonated with people, because I was a hard worker and I learned quickly about how things worked, and I was very curious. And I didn't have any expectations about, I'm going to be the cinematographer on this project, in 4 days. It's like, no, I don't, I had no sort of timeline. And I think that resonated with people. And ultimately that they'll tell somebody, because that's how it ultimately works. And it still works to this day, as someone says, I met this guy and, he worked really hard, and here's his number. And slowly and kind of naturally, that just builds into a career, and ultimately you sort of just, one connection turns into another connection. And I mean, there's people that I've worked with for 30 years that were standing beside me on a set, we were both like getting coffee or whatever. And now, they're a gaffer or they're a director. I mean, one of the people I did 2 features with was the assistant director on the very first project I did, where I was driving the motorhome and, getting coffee and carrying sandbags or whatever, anything that needed to be done. And we've since done 2 features together, and he's a writer director. And, it's just the important thing to remember is that you're always being assessed every minute that you're working. And sometimes you think like, this person may not have any bearing on me, but the reality is that everybody in a set has to work together. So everybody's assessing everyone all the time subconsciously. But ultimately you build I'm sure it's that way in school too, where you find people that are like-minded and you find kindred spirits. And then ultimately you realize that you have a lot in common, you have a relationship, and then you take those relationships with you. That's kind of how it works. Basically, it's just do the best work you can all the time and you'll do fine. That's the simplest career advice ever.
My question is more, what was your mindset when you were starting? Because I feel like a lot of students could be really terrified of quote unquote not succeeding or not making it. At least that's a concern that I heard a lot. And it's almost kind of like sitting in the back of your mind, and that you need to like go and do everything. I was wondering if that was something similar that you went through and how you dealt with it, or if you had a different mindset that could have helped you out better during that time when you were starting.
I'd like to tell you that fear goes away, but it never does. It's still, every day is the same thing where you're like, every time you get a project, you're like, oh, this could be the one, the gig's up, I've been fooling them so far. And then, one day it's like, oh, you know what? I'm a hack, but that's an overstatement. But the reality is that I think success has to be purely relative. I think you have to, certainly when you're starting out, you have to look for small victories. I think if you think you're going to go out on set and you're going to knock them dead and you're going to be the superstar, that is a great ambition. But I think it's important to go out and realize that, like I said before, this industry is one that one of constant learning and constant development. And I think success has to be gauged based on that, and based on, what did I learn today? How did I get better at doing, if my job is to hold a stop sign to stop traffic, how did I do that today a little better than I did yesterday? And it's that sort of slow evolution of skills. And I think that's the best gauge for success, because it can be paralyzing when you go onto a set, because it's an intimidating environment. You're surrounded by a lot of strong personalities, and there's a lot going on. And, people generally don't have a lot of patience, time's of the essence. So there's a lot of pressure. And I think it's important just to focus on doing the work that you have to do, and focusing on those small victories, and trying to find ways to just do sort of those marginal gains and small improvements in your process. Because when people see that, like, I know when I see someone who's trying to make things better, I know that they care, and I know that they're passionate about it. I know that they'll ultimately make it. If someone is like, it sounds stupid, but the smallest things, when you see people try to do it a little better the next day and a little better the day after that, and you sort of see these slow progressions of skill set, that to me is success. And that's still success, for someone who's been doing it as long as I have. You still have that thing where you're like, yeah, I did, I've done a lot of scenes like this, but this one was just, I don't know, there was something about it that was just, it kind of went to the heart of it a little more. Or, I just felt like, it did something that just made it more real or more authentic, or, I got out of the way of it, or, whatever that was. But it's that process of finding those little small victories that can ultimately lead to you feeling like, like you're ready to move on, you're ready to move up, and that you can progress as a creative person. I think the key thing is to don't get intimidated. I mean, it's obviously an intimidating environment, but when you get hired on a set, you're part of a collective, you're part of a crew. There obviously is a hierarchy. That's the nature of the film business, is there's levels to things, and there has to be. It can't be a total democracy, because it would just be anarchy. But at the same time, it's important to understand that you're there for a reason, and you have a role, and know what that role is, and know how that role fits in, and how that role can help other people. And then that will ultimately get you a lot of work from a lot of people, because they're like, that person's part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. And that's our kind of people.
I have a question. It's pretty simple. I was just wondering, like, what are some of your favorite films, like, in terms of cinematography?
Jordan asked me for a list of 5 films, and I took kind of a weird approach to it. I didn't, because I think ultimately, what I consider great cinematography is not necessarily what other people might consider great cinematography. But there's a few films that I consider great storytelling, and there's also a couple I listed that are just kind of interesting to kind of open your mind up about how to use the camera. Because to me, cinematography is a holistic thing. It's not just about lighting. It's not just about looking great. It's about telling the story, and it's about integrating the photography into the storytelling in such a way that it's almost invisible, and that you can't imagine it looking another way, because it's so intrinsic to the story and it's so connected to the story. And there's a few films that I feel have done that. And also I chose a couple films that were very simple. I think simplicity, certainly when you're starting out, simplicity helps. I think it's important to be ambitious with your storytelling, but I also think that, there's a point when you can reach too far beyond your grasp, and it can end up getting in the way of the storytelling. So the first one I'll mention is sort of a really left field thing. It's actually the first 20 minutes of WALL-E, the animated film. I always bring this up as an example of really incredible visual storytelling, because there isn't a word spoken for the first 20 minutes of WALL-E, but they spend that time beautifully constructing the world that he lives in, how he lives, and you learn a lot about his character, even though it's animated. And it's interesting that WALL-E was one of the first films that actually employed a cinematographer in the strictest sense of the word. They had Roger Deakins come out and consult on it, so that it was essentially try to make the photography more real and more authentic. But the first 20 minutes of WALL-E is pretty amazing. It's just, you watch it with the sound off, you can watch it with the sound on, it doesn't matter. And you can find out everything you need to know about this character, how he lives, how he got there, and maybe where he's going in that first 20 minutes. And it's really remarkable storytelling. I mean, from a photography standpoint, even though it's animated, the choice of camera angles, the sense of scale, the world building, the sense of place is really remarkable. It's quite a feat. And I actually had the good fortune to meet that director on Tales from the Loop. He was doing an episode, and I foolishly didn't tell him that I thought the first 20 minutes of WALL-E was genius until an email that I sent him like a month later. And he said, maybe you should have opened with, I think the first 20 minutes of WALL-E is genius. But anyways, he's a very nice guy and very talented. So, I mean, I'd recommend that one. I've always been a huge fan of Darius Khondji, the cinematographer, just because his work is always different and always unique and always serves story. And Seven, which is a David Fincher film, is a brilliant movie. And it's almost a cliche to reference it because everybody's references Seven, because it's an incredible film. I'd recommend watching it just because the sense of mood and the sense of tone in that film is really quite something. And it's incredible to look at. I think No Country for Old Men is almost a perfect movie. I think it's worth watching as a lesson in economical storytelling. We talked earlier about the signature being faint. The signature in that film of everybody working on it is almost invisible, but it's collectively an incredible piece of filmmaking. And if you watch it just with an eye to how they convey the information, simple little things and really subtle but really smart storytelling, that's a great film. There's two films by Gus Van Sant. I'm sort of cheating and putting two together, but Gus Van Sant, who's a great director, he did two films that were very experimental. One's called Jerry and one is called Elephant. And they're really odd films. Elephant is sort of inspired by the Columbine school shootings. So it's a dark film. The reason I include these films, Jerry and Elephant, on this list is because they use the camera to tell the story in an unconventional way. There's a lot of long shots. There's not a lot of traditional coverage in the sense of, close-ups, shot, reverse shot, wide shots, establishers, that sort of thing. It's unconventional storytelling. And it kind of opens your mind up about how to use the camera to tell the story in a way that is untraditional. And it just gets you thinking differently about how to tell the story. That it doesn't necessarily always have to be about editing. It doesn't always have to be about close-ups and traditional technical storytelling, that you can actually use the camera in different ways. So they're admittedly very arty films, but I think that there's a lot to learn from them in the sense of just opening your mind. I think European cinema in general is a great reference point for how to tell the story differently. I mean, as North Americans, we get very acclimatized to kind of that Hollywood storytelling, and the Europeans just tell stories in different ways. And I love European storytelling because it's very economical. They don't use flashy techniques or really obnoxious things to tell the story. They just tell the story in a very succinct and economical way that gets to the heart of it very quickly. And I think European films are a great thing to watch with an eye to that, and they're generally very beautiful. And the last film is actually one that I think as students is a really great film to watch. It's called Ghost Story. It's literally Casey Affleck wearing a bed sheet, and he's a ghost in this movie. And if you read it on paper, you'd think this sounds like a terrible movie, and it doesn't sound like it should work. And I don't think I'm going to believe this story of watching a guy walk around in a bed sheet with two holes in it. But it's a remarkable film. And it had a very small budget. I think the budget was less than $1 million. But it's a really beautiful story. It's really incredibly well told. And it's very simple. Like I said, it's a guy in a bed sheet. They could have done it a number of different ways with vis effects and all these things. But there's something about it. It's almost impossible to put your finger on what it is about that film that makes it work. But as students, I think you might find it inspiring to look at it and say, like, okay, this is something that it's not a big scale. I mean, obviously it has, big name actors in it because they probably, did it for next to nothing, but that's not really the point. The point is it's incredible storytelling. It's so simply done, and it's such a beautiful universal story. And I think there's something that in that film that everybody can take away. And it's just that I think it's one of the best movies I've seen in the last 10 years. And just because it's so simple and universal, it's really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing so many diverse films and really thinking outside of the box with your answer. I really appreciate, such a broad spectrum of recommendations that I think can serve to both inspire in a more tangible way students, but also in a more aspirational way and thinking bigger and more creatively.
I think it's easy to talk about things that, aesthetically, there's lots of beautiful movies, but I'll go on a very short tangent here, Jordan, bear with me. But I think that the one thing to remember as a cinematographer is that it's about storytelling. And, these movies are not movies that let the aesthetic take over the storytelling. And I think that's an important thing to learn from. That's part of the reason I brought up these 5 films, is because ultimately you want to use the camera to tell a story. And that involves lighting, that involves movement, that involves all those things. But ultimately it's a storytelling tool. It's like a pen and paper, and that's what you're using it for. So always bear that in mind.
Thank you so much for being on this first episode of Film Kid Asks, and thank you to all the participants who had questions. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on your experience in the film industry, but also on how we can really take advantage of our current situations and how we can serve on set in a small way. I think that was really important to hear as someone who, obviously you want to dream big, but I think it's also important to realize that every role in the set is important, and that, we can take this time to really be on set, be a sponge to learn as much as we can, and be as helpful as we can. And that, I think, is a great tool to take with us and move forward. So thank you so much for coming on, Craig. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you and hearing your thoughts. And be sure to stream Umbrella Academy Season 2 on July 31st on Netflix.